A prolific writer and public speaker, Andreas is a prominent Canadian thought leader and advocate for innovative approaches to social change, particularly in the areas of public health promotion, climate change awareness, and citizenship. I would also add that he is a lovely, warm person, and when I first met him after an hour-and-a-half lunch, I felt like we were old friends. So I'd like to invite Andreas up.
I was about to boycott this and leave and go home because I thought it's impossible to speak after Lynn. Like, this is just unbelievable. What I was looking at you thinking, what can I possibly say to match that? Congrats, that was such a passionate talk. I'm not passionate, I'm weird. I'm very weird. They asked the weird guy to come and finish your day. And I'll tell you in a second why I'm so weird, but one of the weird things I do when I give talks is because I don't like monologues, I cut my speech down to half of the allocated time, and then we'll spend the second half with you asking me tough questions, because that'll make it a little more interactive and frankly a little clearer to you. So Elizabeth asked me to come here and tell you the Andreas story because she thought correctly that the Andreas story bleeds into the carrot story. And the carrot story, which I think most people in Ontario now know, has a lot of background that you may have not heard. So you get to hear the kind of the founders or the inventors' secret background. But before that, let me tell you my weird story. I believe everybody's getting a copy of my book, or a number of people are. So I decided a few years ago, for the benefit of younger Canadians, to finally put my twisted story into a book, into a memoir that's called Misfit, because I think I'm the biggest misfit around. And I grew up feeling like a misfit. I grew up feeling extremely marginalized as a kid. I couldn't understand quite why. There were a lot of things about me that were really bizarre. I was the outcast in school, nobody wanted to hang out with me. And on top of all of the obvious stuff, my biggest, darkest secret as a kid was that I was gay. I was gay, not even in Canada, but in Southern Europe, in a society that was so extremely homophobic at the time that I was absolutely terrified of being me. And at the tender age of 18, I packed up my bags and moved to Canada on my own, thinking that I'm moving into a much more inclusive society, which Canada indeed was. But I went from being an outcast in one obvious way, which is that I was gay, to suddenly being an outcast in a second obvious way, because now I was an immigrant. So strike two against me. All of a sudden, when I realized that I was the different guy in yet another way, I thought, man, I'll never amount to anything. And then, over time, it became obvious that there was a third way in which I was an outcast, a much more significant way. In fact, I'm autistic. And back in the 80s, nobody knew what autism is. They just assumed that you were just quirky. But as time progressed and as I began to try and make my career stick, it became very obvious that because of my autism, I couldn't hold down a job. I think I invented the gig economy 30 years before it was invented, because I was the guy who was jumping from one thing to the next. Thankfully, they were getting better and better over time, but I never held on to anything for longer than 4 years. And through that process came an interesting miracle, a miracle that frankly taught me that being different can be good. One of the quirky things about my autistic brain is my obsessive, truly, truly obsessive fascination with numbers. I am the biggest, hungriest devourer of numbers you've ever met. I need numbers to feed my quirky brain. And when someone needs information like this, they always look for outlets. They always look for places where they can get lots of numbers. I mean, you can get numbers by driving down the road and looking at distance signs and license plates or memorizing people's phone numbers, or you can get numbers by being totally, totally possessed with the weather and climate. Because, of course, the weather and climate is just this massive, endless buffet full of numbers. And so I grew up, so from the age of 5 or 6 onwards, literally obsessed with the weather, being able to sit here and have dinner with one of you and bore you for the next 3 hours discussing the weather in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia today, and why it's different than it is in Toronto. It was the world's most useless hobby. It made me incredibly boring. It made me incredibly unpleasant to be with. But all of a sudden, about 12 years ago, it made me incredibly relevant. Because 12 years ago, the world began to have conversations about climate change. And all of my peers at the time I was a CEO of an old marketing agency, and all of my fellow marketing CEOs across the country would hear words like climate change or global warming, as we used to call it back then, or green, and they would think it's some crazy new fad that they could maybe exploit and try and sell you a few more, green glasses of something. And I happened to be the geek who got it. I understood a dozen years ago that this thing that was about to hit us in the face was going to change the world forever. It was absolutely going to change politics, geopolitics, consumerism, everything you can possibly imagine was going to be influenced by climate change, and quickly. Within a decade, look how different our world is today and the conversations we're having today compared to a dozen years ago. So here I was, for the first time in my life, finding that this geeky corner of my brain gave me a unique niche, an advantage that I could somehow exploit. The way I exploited it is I looked deep into my industry. The corner of the marketing industry I was involved in until then was the loyalty industry, the rewards industry. All of us Canadians know what that means because we happen to be the nation that is most addicted to points. We love collecting points everywhere. And because points have lots of numbers behind them, I loved working in that space and I was pretty good at it. And so I wake up one day and I realize that nobody had thought of harnessing this incredible power of the points industry for good. We used to give people points for switching from Rona to Home Depot, or from switching from Air Canada to WestJet, or for switching credit cards. But we never thought, hey, if points work that well, if they have such a profound impact on behavior, why not use points to get us to do better, live better, transport ourselves better, buy better products at the grocery store, whatever it may be. And so, it was one of these moments where you think, really, have I stumbled across something that nobody else has thought of? And so I quickly looked around the world, and it was true. Not a single person seemed to be working on an eco points program at the time. This was 2006, 2007. And so I thought, let me give it a try. And I was lucky enough to have been reasonably networked by then, to have a bunch of other crazy people around me who believed in me. And we raised a bunch of money and started a program that was about the size of your little finger at the time, but it was meant to compete against the multi-billion-dollar giants in our country that defined the point space. Think Aeroplan, Air Miles, all those huge programs. Here we show up, kind of as the Antichrist, and saying, we are going to destroy your business because we are going to start capturing this awesome new spirit and wave of consumers who want to be better and greener. We will give consumers points not when they shop, but when they shop well. We'll give them points not when they buy any groceries, but when they buy good groceries. Not when they get a credit card bill in the mail, but when they actually get an e-bill in the mail so they don't waste paper. And whatever other thousands of permutations you could think of. Well, it really was the first of its kind, and it really captured a lot of people's imagination. It really captured the media's imagination. The media, as you can imagine, loves a David and Goliath story, and we were the tiny little David. So we, in no time, had pissed off everybody. Everybody. Every gigantic loyalty program in this country wanted to either destroy us or buy us. And so the beauty of that story is within 19 months, this weird guy who thought that he was being an inventor for the first time in his life and was finally breaking out of convention was all of a sudden acquired by convention. I was acquired by the largest points program in North America, Air Miles. Now, here's the good news. Air Miles didn't hate us, and Air Miles didn't buy us to throw us in the garbage. They actually wanted to buy my company in order to allow our green DNA to actually infect them. They realized the world was changing. They realized there was a great opportunity to use the power of the points industry to change consumerism in our country. And as you probably know, Air Miles is so popular in our country, it reaches into about 70% of the households in Canada. So all of a sudden, I felt like the luckiest guy on earth because somebody not only bought my company and gave me a check, but they literally handed me this gigantic steering wheel with 70% of the households in our country under my influence and said to me that every time you turn the wheel a couple of degrees, there'll be 100,000 people that might follow you to a different kind of behavior. and started doing some crazy stuff. I won't bore you with the details, but over the next 2 or 3 years, we started doing all kinds of interesting things to all of you. We started giving you more air miles for buying the right booze at the LCBO, or buying the right groceries at Metro, or whatever it was we're trying to do to you. And we were doing it authentically, and we were doing it well. And we started being celebrated all over the world. Truly. In fact, one of the highlights of my career, which is a very twisted highlight, is I was invited into the palace by Prince Charles to have a meeting with the Prince to discuss how we could take this miraculous program from Canada into the UK. And believe it or not, I had to say no to the Prince. So it was kind of cool. There's many, many other moments like this that occurred along that journey. But 2 surprises ended up defining my future after that point and creating this crazy carrot thing that you all hear about these days. Surprise number 1. We got a call 7 summers ago from the government of Ontario, who called us at Air Miles and said, hold on a second, you guys are using Air Miles now as an incentive for every Ontarian or for every Canadian to behave better when they shop. Why can't we, the government, start using Air Miles or points as incentives for our citizens to behave better when they live? Not just when they shop, but in their everyday lives. When they choose to take the bus instead of taking their car, when they choose to turn off the lights at night or conserve gas for their home or whatever it is. Why can't we, the government, access the same power of your points program instead of wasting taxpayer dollars on advertising? Because when you think about it, until that conversation happened, there wasn't a single government anywhere in the world that relied on anything other than advertising to speak to you and me. Every message we ever get from our governments about drinking responsibly, driving responsibly, conserving electricity, whatever it may be, all of those messages come to us through advertising because that's the only way governments can talk to us. All of a sudden they're saying, hey, if we could use the power of micro incentives, if we could give Andreas 5 air miles when he commits to something or when he does something or when he reads something, could that work better? And of course I can tell you how much better it worked. The first program we ran with an agency of the government of Ontario 7 summers ago saved them, if you can believe this, 97 cents on the dollar. So for every dollar they used to spend convincing one of us to do something, they were now achieving the same results for 3 cents. And so as you can imagine, the shockwaves traveled across the country, and all of a sudden we had agencies calling us from every government level and every government department across Canada saying, hey, what about my transit adoption program? Or what about my recycling program? And every other green idea you can imagine from across the land. And we were scrambling to keep up. And just as we're scrambling to keep up, surprise number 2 occurs. We get a call from BC, from Victoria, the Ministry of Health in that province. And they say to us, hey, why are you guys only doing this with government agencies that have to do with green? Why can't you let us, people who work to promote healthy living, which is such an incredibly important and expensive file, and we only do it through advertising, why can't you let us also access your points and use them as micro incentives to reward people when they eat healthy, or when they learn about how much exercise they should get, or when they get their flu shot, or mental health, or whatever. And we scratched our heads, and I'll tell you, by that point, I was actually feeling a little embarrassed that I was being out-innovated by a government. That doesn't happen very often to an entrepreneur, but we were so proud to get that call. And so that very summer, so now we're talking 6 summers ago, we're getting closer to today, that summer we ran the world's first program across British Columbia, rewarding British Columbians with a few aeroplane miles, or a few air miles, sorry, if they went to the grocery store and bought at least $15 worth of fresh produce. And let me tell you why that's important. The average Canadian, you'll be ashamed to hear this, the average Canadian, when we go to the grocery store, we spend $6.30 on fresh produce. So it's a pretty low number. So we thought if we raise the bar to 15, and we only give them the points if they spend that much on fresh stuff, first of all, the stuff is not getting wasted. If they buy it, they're going to have to eat it because it's not going to sit in a cupboard, it's fresh produce. Second, it'll be an interesting test to see, does it work? Well, let me tell you, it worked so well that summer that we almost ran the grocers in BC out of fresh produce. It was actually kind of frustrating and embarrassing for them because the grocery business, as some of you would know, is extremely, extremely predictable. And all of a sudden, we created such a departure from the norm. 4% more produce was sold in BC that summer than ever before. And so it was another revolution that we were creating inside the whole kind of healthy living space. The problem with all that, with everything I was inventing along the way, is because my company was owned by Air Miles, the only reward we could offer you for any of these brilliant ideas we were getting from the government was Air Miles. And if you didn't happen to collect Air Miles, we couldn't reach you. And frankly, governments don't like not offering us choice. They don't like favoring one program and making it look like they're in bed with Air Miles when really consumers like choice. And because the choices that exist in our country are many, and because we are all so hooked on points, I don't know if you guys know this, but we are officially the most points-hooked society in the world here in Canada. And don't ask me why, because nobody can explain it. Because of that, we came up with a bigger idea that went beyond Air Miles, where we decided to actually combine the three forces that would have an incredible impact on every consumer in this country. And again, back to my twisted numerical mind. One of those forces is our addiction to points. Our second force was becoming pretty evident, and it was our addiction to our phones. Because when you think 4, 5, 6 years ago, we were all getting really, really hooked on our cell phones. And every single one of us was walking around with one of these in our pocket. In fact, it had become our lifeline. And the third thing that was emerging around the world, and some of you may know it, is now called nudge theory, or more formally known as behavioral economics. And the whole idea of behavioral economics is that instead of pushing us to quit smoking, if somebody comes up with a smart way to nudge us on the very gradual journey to quitting smoking, the results can be far, far better and far cheaper. And so we decided if we combine these three things, if we create, imagine this, an app for your phone that not only is free, but it gives you whatever points you like every time you do something with it, every time you read something on it, or every time you let it kind of nudge you towards a healthier lifestyle. And if we embrace nudge principles completely, so we don't ever offend you or push you too hard. So if we kind of create this combination of smartphone, loyalty addiction, loyalty points addiction, and nudge, we could produce incredible results. And so that's Carrot. Carrot was created 3 years ago in partnership with our federal government. It has become the most popular wellness app in our country. Very recently, we celebrated our 1 millionth download. And if you think of how small our country is, to get 1 million people to download an app like this, it's pretty amazing already. But more importantly, it's not about how many people have Carrot, it's about what Carrot does to us. Carrot is this really friendly app that gives you whatever points you love. You can choose, and you can change your mind, and you can switch from Aeroplan to Scene, or to whatever it is that suits your lifestyle. But the best part about Carrot is it asks you to do some really, really tiny things. It says, oh, read this healthy recipe, and we'll give you 5 Aeroplan miles for reading it. Guess what? That is way, way cheaper for governments than trying to bombard us with leaflets at our doctor's office teaching us how to eat healthy. Way cheaper. We just had a meeting with one government department actually that bettered the results I told you about earlier. There was one government department in Ontario that recently told us that by using Carrot, they reduced their per acquired person marketing costs by 97.5%. Our previous marker was 97%. So now for 2.5 cents on the dollar, they get the same results. So whether they're trying to brainwash us about eating healthy, or about why we need to get our flu shot, or where to get our flu shot, which is part of nudge, by the way, you don't give them points for getting their flu shot, you give them points for all the steps that would get them to the flu shot clinic to get their shot. Or any mental health ideas, or smoking cessation, or anything you can imagine. In all of those areas, we now kind of bombard you with knowledge, and as you consume that knowledge, we give you a few points. And what it has done for governments is it has changed the model forever. The old model was somebody would write $1 million check to buy an ad campaign and pray that it works. Now, they say, great, go give them 5 Aeroplan miles each. But they only get the miles if they do what we ask them to do. If they watch the video beginning to end, or if they read the recipe, or if they go to the flu shot clinic, or whatever it is we're asking them to do. So now, all of a sudden, governments are starting to actually like the idea that they only pay if they win, if they actually generate results. Otherwise, it doesn't cost them anything. And I'm saving the best for last. We started that way with Carrot, but the way we're ending with Carrot is with an even more stark behavior change accomplishment, which we only began 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we realized something else about people's phones. People carry their phones on them all the time. And because we have our phone on our person as we walk around town, without us knowing it, it counts our steps. Our phone is the best pedometer we have, whether we like it or not. Some of us don't even know. We don't even look into our phone to see how many steps we walked. But every one of our phones is a pedometer. So we thought, together with government, why don't we start encouraging people to walk more? Why don't we just look at the average steps that every Canadian has walked over the past 2 weeks, take that average, set it as their objective, as their daily goal, and for every single day that they achieve that goal for the rest of their lives, give them a couple of points. And I'm not exaggerating, a couple of points. Not a couple thousand points, a couple of points. You know, when you think about it, do the math, right? If I give you 2 aeroplane miles a day, it will take you about 5 millennia to get a free trip out of it. But you know what's amazing? Against that 5 millennia threat, we have managed in no time to take 1 million people and have them walking 20% more every single day. It would have cost tens of millions for governments to take us all as a nation and have us walk 1% more per day. In fact, I saw a stat recently that said that for every 1% increase in our physical activity, our healthcare costs as a nation go down by $2.6 billion for 1%. We've taken a sample of Canadians, 1 million, that's not a small sample, and we have them walking 20% more every day. And what's even more important, our message is not aimed at the health nuts. It's not aimed at those who would have walked more. Our message is aimed at everybody else. It's at the couch potatoes, really. And if you look at how the couch potatoes have done, apologies for the term, if you look at the ones that government calls sedentary, which is the lower half of the population, 50% of that 1 million people walk less than 5,000 steps a day, which is pretty terrible. If you look at those people, we haven't increased their walking by 20% a day, we've increased it by 50% a day. So we've actually gone to the real target audience and produced some real change. Let me wrap up by telling you where we're going. Because now that we've tasted this, now we're truly unstoppable, right? The thing that's on my board in my office right now that my colleagues love is the path to 10 million, right? We have 1 million users now. It took us a couple of years to get to 1 million. It won't take us a couple of years to 10 million. We'll get there much faster. Already, we are launching a Carrot equivalent in the UK. We're launching a Carrot equivalent in Australia. We are in discussions with Mexico, which is very similar to Canada, but just much larger. And believe it or not, we're even looking at some stuff in the US. And one would think that Carrot wouldn't apply in the US because they have private health care, but there are ways to do it there too. So this little Canadian story is now starting to spread all over the world. But the other thing that's happening to Carrot in our country is now everybody's recognizing that Carrot isn't just about health anymore. Carrot is about wellness in its broadest possible form. You can now use this thing whether you are a government agency or an insurance company or a bank or any organization that wants to have an influence, a positive influence on the population, you can use this really engaged population of users with this tiny trickle of rewards, which is so inexpensive, to produce all kinds of results. You know, we are now educating Canadians about the environment. We're educating them about financial literacy. We've seen some incredible results on financial literacy, which is a huge file for our country. The latest, which even Elizabeth doesn't know, we just got a call. This is not even official yet, so please don't tweet it yet. But we just got a call from the federal government that they have selected Carrot to become the welcome mat for our country. Carrot will be the Welcome to Canada, essentially, app for all new immigrants. Because think about it. Immigrants show up in our country, the first thing they have in their pocket, a phone. The first thing they start doing, like all of us, collect points. So why not harness that power immediately and connect with them in a much, much more effective way than putting up brochures at an immigration office or emailing them something. So who knows where this will go? We are incredibly jazzed about this little dreamy social venture we've created. It is truly, truly a social venture. We're actually a B Corp and we're very proud of it. And to wrap this up on a very personal note, I ended up writing that book because I realized very, very belatedly in life that all the things that made me weird, all the things that I was terrified of, all the things that I thought were the biggest handicaps and would make me amount to nothing were actually the things that could make me better. There was an interesting line in the foreword of my book that's written by a friend of mine who, against the odds himself, ended up becoming our prime minister right now. And Justin, as I'm sure you know, is almost as weird as I am. He's a character, he's unusual, he defied a bunch of odds for getting to where he got today. And so he wrote the foreword to my book, and my favorite line from the foreword essentially summarizes the book. And that line simply says, "Too often, in our quest to fit in, we end up quashing the very things that could make us special." Thank you.